Reading is not a very common activity these days, especially like how it used to be. Modern fantasy can be traced back almost 100 years ago to Tolkien and other key writers, and many works today are still inspired by them. These are 5 of my favorite fantasy series and ones that I would recommend to anyone. The first series is The Lord of the Rings by J.R.R. Tolkien. It was written in the years 1954 to 1955 and has sold over 150 million copies. I was introduced to this series early in my life through the movies, which I watched with my dad. And after rewatching the movies several times, I wanted to get to know the story a little bit more, so I read the books. Most people know the basic story in the books, which is of a hobbit who has to destroy a ring to defeat some kind of evil. But the main selling point for me in the books was the more minor characters and stories, such as Tom Bombadil, and those little moments really sold the series to me as a whole and made me fall in love with it. The next point I'll be talking about is The Wheel of Time, written by Robert Jordan. It was written in the 90s and early 2000s. Robert Jordan unfortunately had a heart condition, which led to him hiring a co-author to help him finish the last books of the series. While Robert Jordan passed away before the last book could be finished, Brandon Sanderson compiled all of his notes so he could release a good ending to the series. The story follows a pretty standard fantasy trope of a prophecy about a chosen one who's destined to defeat some evil. But what the Wheel of Time adds that I think makes the story interesting is that it's very clear that the chosen one isn't necessarily going to be a good person and that a lot of bad things will happen at their coming. So the Wheel of Time is written over 14 books, and throughout those books, besides just the main stories, there's also dozens of little characters and minor plot points that make the story really interesting to read as a whole. The next series is written by Brandon Sanderson, and it's called The Stormlight Archives. The first book was released in 2010 out of a planned 10 books. The 5th book will be released in fall of 2023. This story takes place on the planet called Roshar, where your social status is determined by your eye color. If you have lighter eyes, you're higher up in the ranking. If you have darker eyes, you're lower down. The magic system in this world is based on a creature called a Spren, which is almost a spiritual representation of an idea or concept. Characters, like the main characters we have, which are Callan, Shallan, and Dalinar, they get their powers through bonding, as you would call it, these Spren, and they get powers according to each kind of Spren they would bond. This is the first series I've read where I had to wait for new releases, so the suspense of waiting in between each book was new to me, and it was an interesting feeling, and it helped me really appreciate the books as they came out. The next series is also written by Brandon Sanderson, and it's called Mistborn. The first book was released in 2006 and has sold 10 million copies. It follows the main character named Vin, who's a petty thief in the capital city of an empire that's commanded by the Lord Ruler, who's like an immortal, godlike person. The book mainly follows her discovering her powers, which in this world is gained by ingesting and then burning the metal in one's body to get different abilities. While Vin manages to kill the Lord Ruler at the end of the first book, the next 2 are focused on fighting a bigger evil called Ruin and developing a more prosperous empire. One thing that I really like about this series is that it's only 3 books long, so it's very easy to get a short series with lots of character development and with a complex plot, but without a huge time commitment like The Wheel of Time would be. The last series I'm going to talk to you about is The Rage of Dragons by Evan Winter. It's probably the most unique series on this list, as it is specified, unlike a lot of other series, it's specified about African Americans or people of African descent. And they're forced from their home and they have to try to find a new home on a strange continent while fighting the local peoples on that continent. The government is based on a caste system where people of a higher caste have much higher privileges and opportunities than people of a lower caste. The story follows the main character of Tao, which is a lower middle class teenager who watched his father get killed unjustly by a noble class. The story follows his quest for revenge, which is unique to a lot of other fantasy series, and it also shows the lengths to which he goes to hold those he finds accountable responsible. And as the character literally goes to this world's version of hell and dies to demons and is reincarnated over and over for the sake of improvement. The most unique thing about the story is that it shows really just how awful a main character can be, where a lot of other fantasy books are, the main characters are very good and almost cartoonishly pure. The Rage of Dragons doesn't pretend to do that and treats Kyle like a normal person with all of his faults and failings. In summary, I've told you about 5 of the series I like, which is The Lord of the Rings, with its classic structure and complex, smaller characters. The Wheel of Time, which is a lot longer of a structure but has many different interweaving plot points. The Stormlight Archive, which is a short, heavily magic-based series. And then the Mistborn Saga and The Rage of Dragons. All of these books are just a small part of the modern fantasy genre, and I would recommend them to anyone to read. And if they don't end up liking these books, there's still thousands of others they could find to enjoy.